Okay, so I'm supposed to do like, explain my development, explain issues, explain the problems. Also doing behind the scenes is good. I don't have footage of me editing this, but I do have the actual like sources, I have the files, like the After Effects files saved. So, here is the shot. So, thwip, web comes out, web hits the thing, pulls it off, I grab it. Nice. So, first bit of footage I got the original shots, so that shot. The catch wasn't really planned to do it. I was going to do it in a separate shot, which I did in this one. I did a bunch of different types of ways of catching it. That one I was like trying to throw it and also catch it at the same time, which didn't really work. That one didn't really work either. But this one, that was the one I used. Because it's an empty frame. I shake and my hand appears there with the cube in it. So if I just edit the cube going from one side of the screen to the spot where I grab it like that, then it looks like I've just caught it out of it coming towards me. That's why I used that. I got some other shots. I got this one where I kind of nudged it a couple times, and that ended up on the tutorial. I also got a blank one. Ended up realizing on the tutorial that to rotoscope out something, you need to have the background of a clear shot. And if it's jittery, then it's not going to look good at all. It's going to look terrible. So it needs to be like a tripod shot. So I got it still. So here's the original shot. Here's me nudging it with my finger. And that was the shot I used. And then obviously I got one with a clean plate. So there's nothing there. Basically, I had to cut out my finger from that shot. Okay, so yeah, basically, it was the footage of me poking my finger on it and nudging it. So I got that because I wanted to have the cube impact and nudge a bit when the web hit it. So obviously I couldn't do that without nudging it with my finger. So which means that I had to figure out a way of getting rid of my finger from the shot. So what I did was I got the main clip of me with my finger nudging it. I got the clip with the background behind it, and I basically cut around the cube. And then I cut around the shadow, so that the cube and the shadow were in the shot, but everything else was replaced by the background footage. Like for example, if I show you this, if I get rid of the clean plate, that's all you see is the cube and the shadow. Right? But you could still see my finger kind of poking in the corner right here, right? On top of the cube. So what I had to do was I had to get this a freeze frame of this frame here. I cut out just the top part of the cube, and I tracked it to go over the top of my finger, with motion blur, of course. So as you can see, it's a little bit off there, the top. So that's basically just me moving it manually, moving this cut out of a freeze frame. And then there it's a little bit off, but again, because it was motion blurred and it was really quick, you couldn't really see. And then my finger had disappeared by this point anyway, so I just got rid of the mask there. And then it just let it fall. And end product was cube just nudging, basically. So that was the first shot that I did. And then the second shot, that took me 2 hours, I think. So yeah, this is me putting in the web effect. I followed the tutorial on how to do this kind of thing, and it was very complicated and very difficult, and very, very time consuming. The entire video took me 7 hours to make. This part alone took me about 5 hours to make. So yeah, it's very time consuming and difficult, but let me just let this render while I talk. Basically what I did, obviously I had that footage where it just nudged, but nothing was nudging it. So I basically used a pen tool to create a shape layer of a line, of a curved line. And I did that with multiple lines, multiple curved lines. And I put effects on them, like turbulent displacement and a shimmer effect and a glass effect, I think it was as well. I put these shapes into a composition, and then I added in some web images, right? Some images of webs, with black backgrounds with a screen filter on them over the top, and then I cut it out around the basic shape of the web. Well, yeah, actually that was a bit later on, but I put trackers onto the cube, onto the spots on the cube that I wanted the web strands to attach to, basically. So I tracked the motion, and then I added null objects to those positions, so that the web strands would have, obviously they were attached to the trackers. So I used, when I had the web effect and when I'd drawn the webs and had all the null objects, I used a puppet tool to pinpoint these the web effect onto the null objects, which were following the tracked motion, the motion trackers, which meant that when the web would be attached to it, and when the cube jiggled or nudged, then the web would follow it. Basically, it would be attached to it, which you can see, which is this point here, basically. Well, yeah, when it nudged there, it was, yeah, that part there. See those frames where it like moves with it. But obviously, I don't just want a video of a web attached to a Rubik's Cube. I had to, obviously animate it in. So I used the puppet tool to stretch the web out, and then have it come in. And then as it hit the Rubik's Cube, it would no longer stretch, it would compress, and like with the cube moving, as you can see here, it goes in all stretched out. Obviously it's motion blur, so it's hard to see, but it hits it and then it compresses, and it has a jiggle effect as well to make it seem more realistic. And yeah, it hits it. And then I duplicated the web effect. I inverted the colors so that it was black and white, and then I put a darken filter on it, I think it was called, to remove the background, and that's how I did the shadow. And the first shot that I got, I'll show you actually. Well, the first draft, I guess. So that was the first draft I got. I think this is the same one with a shadow. Yeah. So here's the shadow. It's a little bit scuffed, as you can see. I tried to remove it from the cube by putting the cube in an opacity layer, because it looked really bad when it was on the cube. But also, it's just in the wrong spot. Like, as you can see, the web shadow is just connected to nothing, and it's too big. It doesn't really make sense where it is. I mean, it kind of works. If it was quick, it would kind of work, but again, it just didn't look great. That's where I stopped for that day, and then I went back to it the day later, and I carried on working on it. So then what I did was I wanted the web to pull it off. So basically, first of all, I moved the shadow so it was more in line, which you can see here. It's more in line with this shadow. And then it took ages to get this looking right, because obviously I didn't have footage of the cube getting pulled off the desk. So I had to manually animate the cube coming off the desk and make it look weighty and realistic, because it just didn't. It took a while for it to look like that, basically. I was like, okay, so I want it to pull it off. So I moved the web, and moving the web meant that I also had to move the cube, and then it just looked like them moving from one point to the other, and it didn't look smooth. So I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll stretch it. So I stretched it, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, stretch doesn't really look great. Just stretching and then moving. If it stretches and moves at the same time, then it just looks like it's still moving. It doesn't really make a difference. So I'll do the stretch a bit before the movement. So it'll like stretch out and then it'll pull it. And then it's like, okay, well then now it shows resistance. Oh, I needed to show resistance to the pulling, because that's how, movement works. If you pull an object, it doesn't just move straight away instantly. Depending how light it is, most objects with weight, they have a little bit of resistance and then they start moving. I know this is a bad example, but it's the best I can do in the circumstances. So here you can see Rubik's Cube, and I've got this bit of like ribbony shit, basically. And when you pull it, it doesn't just move straight away. It has a little bit of resistance before, right? It's not fully tight on it. So it has a little bit of movement where this moves backwards, but that doesn't before it starts moving, right? That was my theory, basically. That's what I was trying to make look good. That's what I was trying to do with this shot. have the web pull on it with a little bit of resistance before the cube actually started moving. So there was a problem with keyframing. So I would keyframe a location, the cube to like move from one spot to the next, by keyframing it in that location and then that location, and then it's supposed to just move smoothly from this location to that location whilst it goes through those two keyframes, right? But instead it would go like backwards and then forwards, which meant that I had to keyframe it like individually. Each frame had to be keyframed on the movement of the cube, because otherwise it just wouldn't follow what I told it to do, which was annoying. So yeah, I ended up what I ended up doing was I was like, okay, so the web is going to stretch. This was going to move forwards a little bit. And I was like, okay, well, the cube can't stand still whilst that happens, so the cube has to move forwards a little bit as well. So it gets nudged forwards a bit. And I also, like, as you can see here, it kind of rotates a little bit towards this way, meaning showing that it is getting pulled a little bit, you know? And then it takes off, basically, and motion blur shows it just getting pulled completely off screen. It was going to, like, pull further up, but obviously it didn't look weighty enough, so I made it just basically just pull it off the desk. Also, I had the problem with the shadows. Cutting out the cube meant that I had to use the clean slate, the clean plate like footage in the background, which meant that I couldn't keep the shadow underneath it whilst for the frames that was being pulled. So that meant I had to create my own prosthetic shadow, basically. So here's the actual shadow. That's from the actual footage of the shadow that it was cast by the cube, and I replicated it there. So that's the replicated shadow. That's not a real shadow. That's a shape with a I think it's a fast blur on it. And yeah, it worked well, and you don't really notice it, to be honest, because it's so quick that you don't. Because the second that it kicks in is when the cube starts moving anyway. And so yeah, it gets pulled, it gets tugged a little bit, there's a little bit of resistance, and then obviously there's motion blur on the shadow as well, and the shadow moves with it. So then yeah, that was the shot. It took bloody ages to do, but yeah, it looks good. I'll show you the final result. But then obviously I had to edit in the shot of me going like, and the shot of me catching it. So I'm going to show you how I did those as well. Alright, so here's the first shot. I just need the web to come out of my wrist. So I was going to just draw the web, like as a single strand, but I realised that that looks really bad, and it was also really difficult. Because as a single strand, it just doesn't look like a web. You kind of need those strands coming off of the front for it to look like a realistic web. Also, what I did was I tried to track a spot on my arm, because it's not a static shot. You know, it's not on a tripod, it's me handheld. Meaning that I would I want to track it to my wrist, so when I shoot the web, the origin of the web basically doesn't move from the same spot on my wrist. But that ended up being really complicated, so I would basically draw the first little bit on that frame that it was tracked on my wrist, and the second frame, the tracker would move up to here, but then the web that I drew would also move because it's tracked there, right? But the controls to edit it, meaning I draw it more or extend it, rotate it, that kind of thing, was stayed down here. Meaning that if I wanted to intricately draw the web coming out of my wrist, I would have to do it over here whilst my hand is up here. So it was really complicated. I could have shown you that on the computer. I would start here, have the web coming out a little bit, then there, it would start coming out of here. It would look like it was coming out of here, but the controls to change it were still down in this spot. I ended up getting rid of the tracker and just tracking it by hand, frame by frame, which ended up working pretty well. And to be honest, the web was light. It's very light and kind of see-through. And I'm quite pale, and the lighting from my window made my skin very white. Meaning that you couldn't even see properly where the origin of the web was coming from, for the most part, or at least not clearly, which was great. It worked in my favour, because it means that I tracked it by hand, meaning it's not going to be super accurate of the origin of the web from my wrist, but you can't really see it anyway, so that's not a problem. So I just got the web effect that I used for the static shot, and I just comped it in here. And I like used the puppet tool to animate it coming out of my wrist, kind of extending outwards, and then also like kind of falling and getting smaller. So I made it smaller and kind of like curve. And then also, because here, the web is, well, it's like the top part of the web. There's still like a massive strand coming down over like here. So what I did was I duplicated the footage. As you can see here, there's like, well, it's kind of hard to see actually, but here's the web strand. And I didn't want it to just come out from this part of my wrist, of my arm. I wanted it to come up here. So I put a opacity layer over a duplicated layer, duplicated footage, and I just cut out this area here. So I overlaid it basically, so it looked like it's coming out my wrist, and it just like covered it up basically. So that worked well. Surprisingly better than I thought it was going to turn out. And then yeah, catching it. But this one was the quickest one to do, and the simplest. Instead of it just being me like catching it, and like no editing at all, I wanted to put a blur of the cube in there for a couple frames, so it makes you think that you can like, you know, there's movement happening. So what I did basically was I got a cutout of the cube, which, you know, here you can see it's got like a hole in it. Let me turn off the motion blur. It's got like a hole in it from where my thumb was in the freeze frame. So it's just like a cutout of the cube with the opacity all the way down and scale down, coming up from the desk quickly to where the origin of my hand was, and then me catching it, obviously, like in that spot. And obviously with the motion blur, it's so quick that you can see that there's something moving towards my hand, but it's so quick that you don't see what it is or whatever. And yeah, that whole process took 7 hours to make that 10-second video. But yeah, that was the shot. That's how I did it. Obviously, I wish I could show you it more in depth, in more detail of step-by-step how I did it. If I had a video of, like a recording of me actually editing it, I would show you. It would be a lot of footage that I'd have to edit down or whatever, because it's 7 hours it took me to do it. But I think I explained it pretty well, and yeah, cool.